I'm going to start the recording. And I also wanted to invite you to make this webinar a safe space where all of us can feel good, where the communication is done focused on diversity, care, affection, and radical kindness. And I wanted to thank the support of my coworkers from WILPF Spain and from WILPF International, also from the Initiative for the Treaty in No Renovation of Fossil Fuels. And that's what this webinar is about. And as Beatriz would say, this is part of a bigger project. And we also want to thank the presence of the speakers that accepted participating in this meeting. And without them, we wouldn't be having the sense that we have today. And before handing the mic to my wonderful coworker Beatriz, I also wanted to share with you all that we are very happy and very grateful to see the interest that has generated this. And we've had over 160 registrations for over the 5 continents and way more than we expected initially. And that's a global example of what we're going to be speaking of this afternoon and the interest that exists to the focus that WILPF has for the International League of Women for Peace and Freedom. And this is the of peace feminism focus. If during the webinar, is there anybody that wants to ask a question, you can put it in the chat. I'll be recording these questions. And similarly, since a lot of us are here from other countries, if any of you have an experience that you would like to share, WILPF Spain, we're very open for you to contact us and share with us, because this is the start of a very much more long-term project. And I just wanted to welcome my coworker Beatriz Hernan. She is a member of WILPF Spain and WILPF UK. She's an investigator, and she's the coordinator for the campaign for WILPF Spain for the No Proliferation of Fossil Fuels campaign in Spain. Beatriz, whenever you'd like. Thank you so much, Maribel. Can you all hear me all right? Great. Good afternoon, good morning, good night, depending on where you are in this moment. And I say this because we have received over 160 registrations from all over the world, from all over the continents. And I thank you for this great welcome and for the support. I wanted to briefly present what is this, the Treaty for No Proliferation of Fossil Fuels, the campaign that we're having in WILPF Spain in support of this treaty. Finally, I'm going to be sharing a framework to place the interventions of the coworkers about why it's so necessary to end fossil fuels. It's not just an ecologist thing, but it's also a feminist and a pacifist question. So I'll start. The initiative to the Treaty for No Proliferation of Fossil Fuels. It's a global initiative in response to the petition that is being headed for Vanuatu and Tuvalu, and actually is being backed by 13 governments all over the world, like Fiji, Timor, Antigua and Barbuda, Samoa, Colombia, European Parliament, and starting yesterday, the Marshall Island Republic. It is being backed by over 100 cities, and cities like the state of California, Calcutta, Sydney, Montreal, LA, Paris, London, Rome, Amsterdam, or Barcelona. It's also being supported by over 2,500 institutions and organizations of civil society, like the World Health Organization, Amnesty International, Extinction Rebellion, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, and others. The proposal for this treaty is based in 3 pillars. 1, to facilitate the world transition that is just for all countries, workers, and communities, helping them to break their dependency on fossil fuels, to democratize the access to renewable energy, and to diversify their economies towards a development without fossil fuels. 2, to stop the proliferation of carbon, fossil fuel, and gas, prohibiting all new projects of exploration and production. And 3, to reduce progressively the current production of fossil fuels according to the climate agreement of 1.5 centigrades in a just and equitable manner, with a transition with the rich countries due to their media and their history of emissions. WILPF International has added itself to this initiative at the end of 2022, and WILPF Spain did this in 2023. This support to the initiative that our campaign of WILPF Spain is part of means one more step in our feminist activism, pacifist and anti-militarist feminism, and in favor of environmental justice. We believe this treaty has the potential that is necessary to become an instrument that will help a world peace that is sustainable, just, and transformative. In this way, with Spain, we started our campaign in favor of the initiative for the Treaty of No Proliferation of Fossil Fuels at the beginning of this year. Our campaign that we presented here is 4 lines of fundamental actions. The first one is the support for the initiative and coordination of the campaign for WILPF España. The second is the creation of a national network of organizations for civil society that support the initiative. The third is public awareness, what is the webinar is part of. And the 4 is political advocacy with local governments and political parties, for which we are going to be publishing a report with recommendations for action. Among other things, the Spanish government can follow this initiative for the Treaty of No Proliferation of Fossil Fuels. Now I'm going to share with you a general framework for reflection about the links between fossil fuels, armed conflict, militarization, and environmental crisis from a focus of pacifist feminism. Fossil fuels are the main cause of the environmental crisis. They are responsible for 86% of the total emissions of CO2 in the last 10 years. The International Agency of Energy thinks that the development of fossil fuels is not justified with the objective of the Paris Agreement. In 2023, the General Secretary of the UN, Antonio Guterres, declared that the fossil fuels are not compatible with human survival, and that the only way to save the planet from this climate catastrophe, environmental catastrophe, would be ending fossil fuels once and for all. However, most of the governments around the world are planning to produce over the double carbon, gas, and petroleum that what the Paris Treaty Agreement allows. In the same way, fossil fuels are behind most of the armed conflicts of the last few decades, whether it's motivated by the access and control of where fossil fuels are found, or for the dependency of the global north for fossils that do not from places that don't respect human rights, like Saudi Arabia or Russia, or simply because it is fossil fuels that allow the functioning of airplanes, war tanks that attack populations and invade their territories, like in the case of Israel and the Gaza Strip right this moment. We also remember that the armies are the biggest consumers of fossil fuels on the planet, and also the biggest emissions of greenhouse gases that provoke the climate crisis. European Parliament in 2023 recognized the links between the fossil fuel industry and the violation of human rights in Uganda and Tanzania. Among others, the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of people from their land without consulting previously or just compensation. In the same way, persecution of the defendants of the climate. The European Parliament mentioned putting the end of the production of fossil fuels and its support for the global transition that is just and equitable. And it was asking the member states to develop a treaty for the non proliferation of fossil fuels. ASEDAO, this is the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, recognizes that the adverse effects of the climate crisis are disproportionately high in those groups of population that are in a vulnerable situation, marginalized situation, or previous discrimination, such as women, girls, or the LGBTQI population, especially in rural areas and the global south, because there's less access to the earth and other resources for income. The climate crisis that are for which fossil fuels are responsible for worsens the gender inequities and it intersects with other discriminations based on race, class, ethnic identity, etc. On top of this, the fossil fuel industry, similar to other extractive industries, often go alongside sexual violence and other violences based on gender, particularly against Indigenous women and environmental defenders. ASEDAO has now said that the governments have to end fossil fuels and promote renewable energies. Aside from the direct impacts that are disproportionate against women, girls, and the LGBTI collective, the fossil fuel industries is very patriarchal because of other motives. It is traditionally the industry with less employees who are women and can be promoted. In Europe, salaries of women in this sector are 20% lower than their male counterparts. We believe that it is not just fossil fuels, the ones that are responsible for the current emergency climate-wise globally, but it's one more of the instruments for capitalism that is extractivist, militarist, colonialist, racist, imperialist, and patriarchal that prioritizes the winnings of one few men at the cost of the sustainability and life of people, ecosystems, and the planet. A future that is pacifist and feminist requires a world free of fossil fuels and all the violences associated with them. The Treaty for No Proliferation of Fossil Fuels has to include the cosmovisions, experiences, and contributions of women who are defendants and activists that are working towards a more just and sustainable world. We also have to bet in favor of a worldwide transformation of all the transformation out of exploitations and to be based in interdependency, responsibility, care, and peace around the world and with the world. And that's why we're here today. And so without any delay, I would like to present our wonderful speakers today that are going to speak to us about three contexts that are affected by exploration, extraction, exportation, and the refinement of fossil fuels like Mozambique, Ecuador, and Colombia. We're going to start with Teresa Cunha, who is an investigator and a feminist activist from the Center of Social Studies of the University of Coimbra in Portugal and the African Center of Studies in Eduardo Mondlane in Mozambique. Teresa is going to be sharing her last investigations with displaced women because of the armed conflict in Mozambique that is directly linked to the extraction of gas in alta mar. Similarly, strategies of peace in this context and the violence that is happening in this displacement. Teresa, go ahead whenever you like.
Thank you, Beatriz, and it's with great pleasure that I'm here with everyone, and also to be able to share some reflections. These reflections, I must say, are the result of various projects of research, participatory action in the northeast section of Mozambique, in the southern region of East Africa. And they have promoted for the Center of Studies of Peace Studies in Gogornatus and the Center for Action Studies in Cabo Delgado. So I'm gonna share my screen and I'm gonna see if everything is going well because I'm not very good with this technology. It's asking me for the speaking language. I'm not able to share, maybe because I'm not the host. Okay, so I wanted to share that some questions that WILPF Spain sent us to be able to organize these reflections. I was organizing my presentation based on these questions. And the first thing, it's very important to talk of the context of Cabo Delgado, which is the northeast uh, province in Mozambique, which has a border with Tanzania and also is has a border with the Indian Ocean on the east side. With for a memorable time, there's been extraction of natural resources of gold, graphite, turmalina, very good quality. Also, from very long time, there's been wood commerce and ivory commerce through commerce that took place for centuries in the east coast of Africa, in particular to with India and the uh, Far East. And there's always been known that there's hydrocarbons in the maritime coastline, while at the same time the colonial governments of Portugal weren't didn't have the technology to be able to extract these resources, and the political economy of extraction of Cabo Delgado has occurred for many, many years, and the populations know that even though they live in material misery, they also live in a land with plenty of resources. But throughout the centuries, this was creating damages that were controllable, but were managed at the regional level. But this changed very profoundly in the last 2 decades. There were three big things that changed. The changes that were provoked due to neoliberal globalization and the policies of development that transformed everything. And when I say everything in terms of merchandise, and also the deepening of globalization of the relationship with capital, and two, the interests of big international corporations and the Mozambique elite, which has been in power since independence of 1975 in the 20th century. Their interest in exploiting the mining and hydrocarbons at a big scale and big intensity, which also represented the uh, increase of the extractive frontiers with the main objective of obtaining electoral wins and economic gains by this elite and the global corporations. There was a there was in conflict with the population, especially the population at Cabo Delgado, in a way that the elites created an idea that became dominant, that the development for everyone would arrive with those with that wealth in the northeast of Mozambique. And so this caused historical resentments that were related to the neglect of this province from the central government, and also the long-time conflicts among local groups, the presence of more foreigners who are taking control of the lands, and also the concessions for exploitations of all these riches, the forced displacement of the population, the loss of access and control over land and water, the changes in the environmental with the uh, cutting of trees and the poisoning of the land and the water, and also the repression of the protests polarize the conditions to basically bring the war into effect, despite also being able to identify other events before this date, which, and this is a third war in the last 70 years, which corresponds of 32 years of war during 70 years of the country is the assault of the police regiment in the north part of the country on October 4th of 2017. So we see the context of the wealth that exists in Cabo Delgado in this diagram. So this diagram shows you how much natural resources and mineral resources that exist in Cabo Delgado, more so than the hydrocarbons. So in this map, and it's important to see it, you can see in the Indian Ocean the areas of exploitation of hydrocarbons, also of gas and petroleum. And here in yellow, you can see the borders in the north part of the country. So in yellow is the province of Cabo Delgado, and you can see that all the exploitation of hydrocarbon is in the north extreme part of the province. And there's also a territory dispute with the Tanzania Republic. And it's important to also share to be able to see, for example, who in France are disputing or exploiting these disputed areas. So the European interests, especially from France, from Italy, from the United Kingdom, and other countries with small exploitations such as Portugal, they're all exploited, involved in those exploitation of hydrocarbons in Cabo Delgado. To give you an idea, a little bit more global and more precise, you can see here the main operators and also the investments. And I'm sorry that these are in Portuguese and I wasn't able to translate everything in advance. But we have Eni that's based in Italy. We have the total from France, the majority of the investments. And this diagram, which is elaborated by my colleague who's also present in this webinar, and shows with a lot of clarity the complexity of data of these different companies in Cabo Delgado. So this diagram shows not only the big corporations, like the global uh, countries that have a lot of power, the most Mozambique entities, and in the center, you can see that in the militarization of conflict, uh, Islamic insurgency, and these stats are not completely updated, but you can see that they're very close to reality. Today, we've seen more displaced and dead, but it's a war that's happening in the territory at the moment. The majority of the people did not return to their towns, and when they do, they find everything destroyed, and oftentimes their towns or their resources are controlled by foreign entities, and they're forced to flee once again. In terms of armed violence, this map shows the clear connection. It's not this one. This one is displaced people between the end of 2023 and March 2024. As you can see, the displacements are many, especially in this region of the north and also in the south of the province, because the insurgents moved around a lot to do a lot of recruitment in the south. And if you see in this map, you can see the attacks of the war, especially in this region, which is very close of the exploitations of gas, of petroleum here in the north of the province. well, we know very little in terms of the environmental damage caused by this exploitation of gas and petroleum, and also through mining and war. And there's two reasons why we don't have systematic studies and in depth about this issue. The first one is that these territories are controlled by military forces, and the circulation of people and information are controlled by the Mozambique army and also international missions and also by international companies or security companies that are hired by international corporations. So it's not possible to be able to access some of the territories that are most impacted. And so we also only know through secondhand sources. So the second reason is that the only information that can be collected is censored due to the government arguing that it's sensitive information to be able to protect their national security of the country. Persecution and disappearing journalists, threatening researchers, and all this is executed by the local governments and the provinces. And so then we also have some oral stories, some photographs, and other information. So among the documentaries, I want to highlight two of them, and they did not focus on the environmental impact, but the images, the stories, you can find a lot of information that relates to this. And the first one is Tierra en Suspenso, which is produced by the Center for Research for Peace, and the Gold Fever, which is produced by the Doctors of the World, Spain, and you can find that in YouTube. And you can access through oral narrations and focal groups. So there's a reorganization of arable lands through extraction projects and also construction of logistical bases that destroyed the habitats and the different forms of life. So there's some studies of the environmental impact in terms of the extraction activities. The studies are subcontracted to international consultants that have a very clear political object, which are to legitimize the actions of the large corporations. And we have the destruction of woods for the construction that provoke more erosion of the lands and disequilibrium among uh, the animal life and human population. And with this destruction of forests, the medicinal plants and other plants disappear. And this affects women in particular, who are the ones who guard these knowledge of natural medicine and that are the ones who do this labor in their communities and their families. And the poisoning of the lands and water through the different impacts of death, of illnesses, etc. And this particularly affects the women because they are the ones who cultivate these plants and distribute them and transport the water for their houses, which is another way of legitimacy.
The direct impact of the different destructions provoke the separation of important social relationships like work on the earth or water with water from the rivers and oceans that are not just jobs, domestic jobs for women, but it's also webs of mutual support that they have consolidated. All this is worsened by the forced displacement that affect women that lose in a tragic way. They lose their way and means of life. They become irrelevant in the communities where they are way more vulnerable to all kinds of violence. And the abnormal succession of hurricanes in the west coast of Africa, particularly in the Mozambique Canal, for example, El Kenneth, the Hurricane Kenneth, and it provoked a huge destruction in the province of Cabo Delgado. It was there was reflections, ecofeminist reflections, African reflections. There was a red alert about the climate change provoked because of global warming and the intensity, the extractive activities in the west coast of the continent, especially the the ones in the canal, in the Mozambique Canal. We also know that the dredges destroy not just the sea life, the ocean life, but also coral reefs that are very important. And we know, for example, that in times of hardship, people don't have anything else to eat, whether it's on the ocean or on the land. And in Cabo Delgado, women also are fisher women who are important. They do. It's very interesting that they're the ones that dominate the fishing. The multiple violences against women in this situation and girls uh, uh, due to their gender, there's a lot of them, and there's a huge impact personally and collectively. I'm going to list the ones that we think are most important. Loss of means of life, and with that, a loss of authority, power, and legitimacy. Social irrelevance provoked by the isolation and the loss of social, spiritual, and political roles. Kidnapping on behalf of military men for sexual slavery and forced work, forced transactional sex for food or clothing, forced matrimony, forced pregnancies, total hardship and suffering, and separation, social and political, through the silencing of their knowledges, analysis, and memories. On top of that, the diversity of violences that have been identified, we also have to consider the intersectional situations that with the oppressions and that create even more and more difficult ways of violence that are difficult to face and how to move on from. Delgado, however, and in spite of the suffering and tragedies that have lived and all the controls and repressions, the girls and women continue to invent every day the day-to-day things that allow them to restore in different ways their dignity, creating work groups, collective work groups in small businesses for means of life, creating small cooperatives of production and business for means of life, groups of collective savings for means of life, groups of dance and singing for healing through art, local committees for peace for women, and also of men and women for healing and the building of peace, local associations to be able to have voice and development, security, and peace, and to have more civic space, collectives for support of victims for family violence, for the pacific resolution of conflicts with feminist perspectives, and strategies to be able to do public protests in favor of peace and justice, and for which it's very important to have imagination so that they aren't controlled by the police, and also they don't suffer violence in civic spaces. There are no initiatives yet that are of bigger character in public spaces about this subject. On the one hand, the war situation limits quite a bit the civic capacity, and it defines priorities within the struggles. The daily survival and the end of the war dominate over other subjects and problems. On the other hand, the local call, the fear pedagogy that the national and local authorities enforce in every moment against all the populations, in particular against women and girls. They have a paralyzing action which sometimes stops them going beyond these microspaces of intervention and reflection. However, on the level of the region and the continent, you can find many other organizations of women who are ecofeminists that are reflecting about the practices, the neoliberal, patriarchal, extractivist practice, and their cycles that are more and more violent within their countries and their regions. And they're taking on protest actions, promoting debates and changes in the law, and building knowledge in these territories. The imagination as power. There's two huge victims of the violences that are born and fed by the extractivist patriarchal exploitation. One is the truth. The other is the social imagination. One is one of the biggest accomplishments of patriarchal capitalism, neoliberal, for the economy, which is the extractive economy. It's the convincing people that there is no alternative, and that so there is no it's not possible to imagine another present or future so that we can become it a reality. Imagination is power, and us women in the world, we know this very well, and we feel it profoundly. We know because of our own experiences of personal liberation, that the our emancipation starts when we are able to imagine life without violence or oppression. And these moments of imagination of what life can be with care, without violence, with radical kindness, it's the crucial time for change. In this sense, a feminist future that's ecological. Well, I still imagine it far away, but I still the will to build it are very active in the collective that I am part of, both in Europe, but especially in where I live in Mozambique. It has in unexpected ways, like the words of Arundhati Roy, with which I will conclude this presentation. Our strategy should be not just to confront the empire, but also to silo it, to take away its oxygen, to shame it, to make fun of it with our art, our music, our literature, our stubbornness, our joy, our brilliance, our complete implacability, and our capacity to tell our own stories. Stories that are different from those with which they are trying to brainwash us to believe. The corporative revolution will be destroyed if we stop buying what they're selling, their ideas, their version of history, their wars, their arms, and their notion of inevitability. Thank you, Asante Sana. Thank you so much, Teresa. Wonderful presentation. Especially thank you for finishing with a little touch of hope. We are going to hand the word over to Ivonne Yánez, investigator and ecological investigator, founder and current president of Acción Ecológica Ecuador. Yvonne's presentation will be about the impacts of petroleum extraction in Ecuador and the destruction of the subsoil and how to transform Ecuador post-petroleum. Thank you so much, Beatriz. I am gonna set my clock to be able to stick to the time that you've asked us to speak to, which is 15 minutes. Well, I don't have a presentation. You will excuse me for that. I honestly did not have time to prepare it, but I think that I can tell you almost face to face the case of Yasumi in Ecuador, and also the relationship this has with this thing about fossil fuels, the relationship it has with violence, and especially the role of women in my country in defense of the territories. I would like to start saying that Ecuador is a country that's called a petroleum country, but we refuse to be identified this way. But Ecuador is a country that since the end, towards the end of the 60s, slowly it became a country in which, sadly, they found petroleum. And it was the Texaco, that's now called Chevron. This company was the one that for many years had the leadership in the extraction of petroleum in Ecuador. And it's Texaco, Chevron Texaco, the one that caused the biggest harm that one could imagine, at least in the case of Ecuador, of the North Amazon in Ecuador. Then Texaco left, but the state business and then many other businesses came with these same practices of complete devastation in the country. This is how, at the beginning of the 90s in Ecuador, we started. There was an organization that was called civil society, even though we don't like the name of civil society, but the community organizations and the environment organizations that in that moment we were creating, we organized ourselves around what was known of the campaign, Amazonian Campaign for Life. And then together and parallelly, we decided that this was the judgment that the people affected by Texaco put it towards the business. And we were trying to reclaim and the knowledge of our own lands. We started organizing a whole campaign towards the defense of the territories, the woods, the indigenous communities, the rivers, on behalf of the health of the people, fighting against the petroleum activities. Even though Texaco is a one exemplary case, it's not the only case. And many businesses, once Texaco left, lots of other companies started, especially towards the end of the 90s, starting of the 2000s, they started to amplify the petroleum business. And as an ecological organization, along with other organizations, what we wanted is to avoid broadening the petroleum business. And we took the National Park Yasuni as the emblem for the defense of the what was left of the Amazon, so that the same thing didn't happen there that happened in the indigenous territories in the northern areas of the Ecuador Amazon. And that was how, even I think towards the end of the 90s, when ecological action started, or Acción Ecológica started with the petroleum moratorium, and then that rapidly was taken on by the international network Oil Watch, which was it's also a founding ecological action. And that was how, on an international level, the campaign for leaving the petroleum in the subsoil started becoming bigger through several organizations like those that were following the climate change on an international level. It was in 2005 that Acción Ecológica, together with Oil Watch, presented internationally the first proposal of leaving the petroleum in the subsoil within the Yasuni National Park in the diverse biology diversity convention in 2005. And then in 2006, we also presented as Acción Ecológica Oil Watch in an international way. We presented the idea that now everybody's speaking about, but this was almost 20 years ago, that we would say since that moment that the only measurable, effective, clear, concrete way to face climate change was to start leaving petroleum in the subsoil. And we put forth a case, like a first step. This was the Yasuni case, in particularly for a petroleum block in which there's also voluntarily isolated peoples there. That is also probably, according to scientists who are experts, it's the area that's most biodiverse in the planet.
And that's how the initiative started, and the international community was able to create it. We conceived it as the international community would be able to make a contribution, a voluntary contribution to Ecuador in order to be able to make these decisive steps to a post-oil or post-petroleum Ecuador. Unfortunately, Rafael Correa, who was the president back then, eliminated that initiative. And not only did he do that, but he did fraud when the young people tried to organize a popular consultation so that all Ecuadorians could be able to decide on this to leave the oil in the land. And after 10 years of legal struggle, of organization, of international protests, and all the kinds of campaign strategies that you can imagine, last year we were able to achieve the popular consultation, and the first time in the world has almost 60% of Ecuadorians decided to leave the oil in the land. And why is this so important? This case of Yasumi, which goes beyond, uh, far above or far beyond just leaving the oil under the land. This is an example of a maximum democracy, of a popular consultation, so that we're able to, as Ecuadorian people, decide what type of country do we want as a country? Do we want an oil country, or do we want a country that we've decided to have this fossil fuels and we have to extract it in any way possible? Or are we a country that takes care of life, a country that takes care of biodiversity, that takes care of indigenous people, and for above everything, a country that seeks to be an example to the world? And so, for these reasons, in the case of Yasumi and Tete, in the case of the campaign to defend the Yasumi, it has been so important to have the engagement of the indigenous, campesino, and women's organizations, not only because it was mentioned by Beatriz and also Teresa in their amazing presentation, because women are the main people impacted by the oil activities. They have a different impact due to their condition as women, intra-family violence, community violence, and masculinization of territories, the cancer that's prevalent in the north of the Amazon, which is 5 times more prevalent than a national cancer levels of cancer. The 75% of cases of cancer are in women's bodies. Women know perfectly well what is violence through their body, through their territories, and of course they completely understand that the solution is in organizing themselves, not only as women's organizations, in monitoring the oil company activities, in the creation of economic alternatives, in denouncing, in the legal actions. So there's a case of 9 children that had a legal case against Ecuadorian state, and they won the case, just like the case against Texaco was one. And the judge ordered that the more than 400 gas flaring, for the translation, and that they need to eliminate those gas flares. And the girls who are now bigger, they said, we don't want our bodies to be in cancer, as the majority of mothers, of their aunts or grandmothers. So the women's organized in Yasumi were fundamental, and not only in Yasumi, but also in the defense of the territories that are being impacted by the oil companies. And I wanted to finish in the last few minutes mentioning the following. Ecuador, in the last few months, has become a famous state due to drugs, the case of people imprisoned. Ecuador has become very known through the images in television that circulated around the world, being a country where violence is associated to organized crime. And it's true, the organized crime not only because of the traffic of drugs, but all other kinds of crimes generate a lot of violence. But what we are saying is that there are many other types of violence that are possibly causing greater death than the violence created by organized crime and the traffic of drugs. And the violence generated are precisely connected to the extractivisms, the exportation in industry, also connected to deforestation processes to have this out of control urbanization. There's a violence against human rights offenders and forest offenders. All of that has a lot more deaths than the crimes associated to drug trafficking or any other type of organized crime. So when we try to define the violence, we have structural violences, violence also connected to organized crime, but also violence connected to a role of development, which is extractivist, but also that has free commerce, where increase in foreign debt and also increasing the impacts on climatic issues. And so I want to finish that the solution to the climate issue, yes, is to leave the hydrocarbons in the land, and that's why we support the non-proliferation of these types of fossils. But we also want to promote that the solutions are not in the solutions that are propose on environmental issues, which are also creating new violences against the peoples, against women, and against nature. And I'm referring to all these plans of green economy. So, like solutions based on environment, there's plans of zero carbon emission, the false solutions that are related to technologies, to renewable energies, because a solution is not to substitute all these carbon uh, production uh, energies, including the aeolic industries when they're massive industries. And we also don't want to create a massive expansion of solar panels. They're occupying indigenous lands, agricultural lands, and the aero generators as well, but that also require a lot of minerals of fossil fuel as well, and also need a lot of other materials, like in the case of Ecuador, the balsa wood, which Chinese companies basically eliminated the balsa wood to be able to create the generators. So the balsa comes back to Ecuador in terms of aero generators because what they're seeking is to have that energetic transition, which is not fair and is not ecological, but is also a transition based on renewable energy that require more fossil fuels and require a greater energetic load than the current systems, and who are going to be the most impacted by these false solutions, which are, and it's once again women, because they form part of the same model. So, in other words, the people who are against oil production, we also need to be against these types of technologies, these false solutions, because they cause the same kind of problems and the same kind of local impacts in the communities and in the bodies and the territories. So, I wanted to finish thanking you all for this invitation. This has been a marathon to come to today, but I hope that what I've been able to share today has been of interest. There's a lot of information in the internet about Yasumi. You can find it, not only the proposal of Yasumi of leaving oil in the territory. But the campaign of Yasumi for the last 15 years have produced a amazing graphic that's being used all over the place. So that's another place, another way of being able to reach people through beauty and also fighting with hope, with happiness, because otherwise we wouldn't be doing this. So we have to maintain the hope, maintain that joy, and of course, continue fighting amongst all the organizations that are in this global campaign of leaving the fossil fuels in the land. Thank you. Thank you, Yvonne, for your excellent presentation and for your structural vision beyond the oil fields and to finish with an optimistic view. So we're gonna now go to Ivene Natali's Yuvelis Natalis Morales, which is part of the Colombia Libre coalition and it's part of the environmental coalition. Yuvelis is going to share her experience against fracking and for protection of water in Colombia, as well as her participation in the signing of the Declaration of Coachi for a non-proliferation treaty of all kind of extractivism. Go ahead, Yuvelis. Thank you. Thank you to everyone. I'm gonna put my chronometer because sometimes I might just go beyond. And I want to start this space and talking, thanking all the women, all the amazing women who talked before me. Thank you. For me, it's always a privilege and an honor to be able to hear from all of you, to learn from all of you. And in this path, we're always learning. So start to talk about fossil fuels in the region. It's always something that I try to do with something that in Colombia we talk as comadreo. Many countries, women, and for me in particular, has been the starting point of the biggest struggles in my life. And that, for example, is living in a region that's beautiful, welcoming. This Valle Medio, the the Magdalena River, is a region of water that in Colombia is the largest river in the country, and with this, one of the regions in which extractivism has been uh, really very active. And I've been part of this group of people, women, men, children, black, young people, women who raise our voices in a country and in a region in which just speaking up is almost prohibited. A few years ago, maybe more than what I would like to think. Fracking arrives to our country, hydraulic fracturing, and it comes with different names, with different transformations.
decided to dream because I have a father and a mother that since I was born 23 years ago, they wanted my reality, my life to be something else, that the life of my brothers and my sisters would be something else, with a lot of difficulty, assuming with strength, facing all obstacles with strength, and also facing this river contamination. So I don't know if the 41 people that are here have seen what happens to a life fountain like a river when there's an oil spill. If you haven't seen it, the description is horrific. The oil starts spreading like a stain that multiplies about 10,000 fold. It absorbs our life, it contaminates the fish, it kills all life in the river. It puts us to keep contributing in a society. When an oil spill in particular gets to our river, people didn't know what to do. I was seeing my dad was running and was trying to find cloth, blankets, and it was placing where our yucca fields were and banana fields were. And at a certain moment, he tried to throw the net to see what he could save. That spill came and ended with thousands. It killed thousands of animals in the river, thousands of fish, and thousands of our dreams because we had planted what we had, what was our livelihood. It's simple, maybe, for the life that other people might know, but for a fisherman in the valley, that's everything. Our nets, our fish, and our plants and fields. For me, that made me rethink the way in which our dreams are being consolidated in a riviera of a river that's so wonderful and so important. And a lot of people have written about this, but not spoken about. I started looking online what was the Magdalena Medio, and it was very impressive. The people that were, it wasn't from the river, it was from other cities, and sometimes it came as foreigners, and they would take the horrific stories that we have lived through. And this is not denying a story that's still happening. There's armed conflict, the conflict with the paramilitary in our region, with the state abandonment, with the illegal possession, with drug trafficking, but especially with the extractivism. In our region today, kilometers and kilometers of aqueducts, tubes that transport oil out of our land and take them elsewhere, and they just destroy us. They take them to a refinery where they transform it, and then they turn them into deadly gases that also end our lives. For me, women, children, we live with regret, something that we would like to reject and that we reject every day, but day by day, it keeps happening and it keeps taking ownership of our stories. As time goes by, and during our lives, it was our turn to leave this bubble of protection and to start speaking out about what it was to be a young and a woman in a territory in which life is natural, in which they've naturalized murder, and where displacement is an everyday thing if you don't agree or if you're trying to protect life. Those those of us, men and women, that today form part of the Alliance Against Fracking, we decided almost however we can to use a technique that for us meant more than even the extension of our own life. And we are working for the protection and defense of our ecosystems, valuing more experiences what for us is the defense of dignity and our territories, the defense of our lives, and demanding justice for our communities, for the kids and youth in our regions, because that deserve life in the region, not death in the region that a lot of people describe. And also not a place where we have to submit to a sacrifice to be able to survive in a world that where they only want to write with oil. And this brings us to the present to speak about a treaty against fossil fuels where we demand youth, kids, women, people of the territory, we demand to leave gas and petroleum in the subsoil. We need it. We ask for it and we demand it because we're not just speaking up just about us, we're also speaking for everyone. We speak on behalf of nature, our nature, and I in particular speak about my river. I would like for the story to continue to be written as big and large and as life is and as that river is. And you can't even imagine, this river is so wonderful. It's a valley surrounded by mountains. It has the best sunsets in the world, and you can bathe there, and life is calm. It's not the biggest river in the world, but it's the biggest river in my heart. And I believe, speaking about the treaty, that if governments, countries, and the whole world, they have failed us once and again. They have failed us as youth, as women, as children, and they've ripped us, and they've not just taken away, but ripped away our dreams. Today, we need to rewrite that great history, and we will rewrite it from the popular forces, from our own convictions, from our dances, from our protests, from all the way of protests that we can have through, legally, worldwide, treaties, all the things that we deserve and that we demand so that our territories can truly be free. Today, we are living through many wars, many conflicts, because people that have a lot want more. And those of us that have little, they want to keep taking more and more from us. But I think in a world in which borders are more and more marked every time, the quality and the life that we're having today demands that we make them invisible. I think that when we speak about territories as countries, as chunks of land are on the other side, maybe of our more of where we can see, we take away the value, we take away the emotion that has for each one of us our own territories. That today I'm speaking about the Magdalena River and such a beautiful place that it is, and I feel like that is what we need the most. And for the treaties, for the life, it's we need this for us, but also for a free nature and for life. I had some notes that sometimes our areas that are sacrificed, they keep being sacrificed because we start sacrificing. And this, when they speak to us about a place and we don't recognize where it is, but sometimes it's not okay that we don't recognize that we are part of that area, we are part of that territory, we are part of that sunset. Maybe today we need to raise our voices as we have been doing since many years ago. Maybe today we're getting together and maybe tomorrow we'll be dancing, and however we want to do it, we need once and for all, for our own consciousness, our governments, our countries, take up the call for the no proliferation of fossil fuels. But at the end of the day, it's also just on behalf of life, life with dignity, life that exists, life that existed, and life that will exist. I think that's what we need the most. We need not just to humanize us, because I think sometimes humanize dehumanizes us. We need to recognize and re-find ourselves being part of not utilizing. And this, I'm referencing something that about the new energies or renewable energies that are even more ancient than we would like to think. And sometimes the terminology is useful to name something that we're defining, that in the territories we recognize that for a lot of us is the advancement, and for others of us is just changing from one extractivism to another. And it makes us think that the solution is there, and it's not. And all of this to conclude saying that I wish for all of us a treaty to re-find ourselves, of freedom, a treaty that is free of fossil fuels, but also, above all, a life that is long and full of dignity that allows us to recognize that territories are also us. And as we start recognizing that place that for us is home, we will also understand why on this side of the pond, this side of the ocean, we are demanding what we need, because life must go on and counting with everyone. So thank you so much. Thank you, Yuvelis, to sharing for your own situation, and to sharing for the spontaneous nature, and again, ending with hope. And once again, we wanted to open up the word to the public. We have gone a little later than we had planned, and we're going to have 10 minutes for a final debate. You can put some stuff in the chat, or if you want to open up your mic to speak, whatever you would like, go ahead. And I also ask for you, when you ask questions, if you could please say who your question is about, who your question is to of the three speakers, please. I see some comments in the chat. I don't know if you would like to speak it out loud, because there's not that many of us right now. I don't know if Jesus Andres Sanchez would like to make this comment. Well, good afternoon. Hi, everyone. I don't think I need to. I think I put it in the chat. And and I think I've seen the way in which you have presented the processes of extractivism that each place is suffering. I think even physically, it's been mentioned in some cases. In the three places, the connection of extractivism with what some authors speak about of the ways of life that are imperialistic, especially in places in the global north, but also on where I say some parts of the population and the global south. And of course, this treaty that's being referred to at the same time, if we need to substitute, not keep consuming oil like we have done so far, but in a to transform into a sustainable way is urgent, because otherwise these ways of life are not viable if we need to transform to renewable energy in order to be able to preserve the ways of life. And so we need to organize the decrease, especially in the global north, in an orderly way, because we have to decrease it, and the question is whether it's going to be chaotic and the fight everybody against everybody, or if we can do it in a just, planned, ordered way. Thank you. Thank you, Jesus. And Jesus is part of IPAS, which is the Spanish Association for Peace, and of which WILPF is part of. Thank you, Jesus. As Sophie has her hand raised, if we could take Sophie's comments, and then the speakers can also respond to Jesus or Sophie, who works for WILPF International. Go ahead, Sophie.
I thank you for this space, for organizing it, and the three speakers, because gave us the opportunity to dream, imagine, especially in these days. It's very necessary. So thank you for that. I have two questions. One for Yuvelis, if you can explain about comadreo, because I can form an image, but I would like to know more about this idea. It was like an important idea with a lot of strength, maybe. And for Teresa, in the case of Mozambique, what type of alliance, a transnational, feminist, peace-based alliances can we form transnationally and to show successful cases of against companies to because I'm also thinking about lithium in South America, I mean Argentina, and there's been concessions to international companies, but to be able to prevent, how do we think about prevention? So that was it. Thank you to WILPF Spain for this amazing webinar. Thank you, Sophie. Well, any of the three who would like to respond, the comments of Jesus or the questions by Sophie, go ahead. I don't know who would like to start. Yvonne, go ahead. Thank you, Beatriz. Thank you for the comments and also Jesus for mentioning these alliance, possible alliances between the North and the South, because we have a lot of alliances South-South and we're always finding each other. We have our own identity in the South, which allows us to coordinate in an easier kind of way. But in these alliances between the South and North, we're able to find common issues to be able to create these alliances. And we have these issue of decline in population, and in Europe, it's the same thing as uh, decrease in population in Europe and in the South. i- It's not the same thing as a Janusization in Europe, but it's a path of reflection. What are the forms of production, of consuming in Europe? Where do most materials come that are being consumed? Where is manufacturing coming from? China, Bangladesh, from the south? So from South America. And so the population decrease is something that we can find common path in terms of what kind of societies we want to find the relationship with nature that we want. How are we going to find our future, knowing that we have to start to leave the oil in the land? So these are interesting communication that we can have between the North and the South, and especially the fact that Wilf is working on this issue of feminisms, and as you mentioned, of the declining population is also fundamental. Well, thank you. It was great to be able to hear colleagues, and thank you, Jesus, for this issue of depopulation and relationships between South and North. I wanted to share that the transition is something very complex and has to be very contextual. It can't be, you can't apply the same rhythms between among Latin America. The South is very diverse as its history, its collective capacities, its imaginations of what is to live well or living well. So we have to be very careful in terms of homogenizing everything, and especially the cosmovisions, the spiritualities are also very important, especially in the context from Cabo Delgado, for example. So decrease in the population where there's almost nothing doesn't make sense. Having decrease in population where you have a family of 30, where tomorrow you don't know what's going to happen. So we have to all imagine how to change our vocabularies, our ways of lives, our imaginations in a way that's very complex and that has to be with a lot of internal democracy and a lot of care. And also what Sophie was proposing, if African ecofeminists, there are many, and I make references to a few. There are others. The ones that I make reference to are from Southern Africa and Eastern Africa, especially because there's a critical mass of ecofeminists who are making, who are denouncing, and who are also in large global networks with other feminists from Latin America, but especially in the ecofeminism is very strong in India, Mandana Shiva and others, Arundhati Roy and others, which are very big names who are collaborating amongst themselves. The making the speaking up is very difficult there because of repression. And talking about the South without any sin is also a big mistake because we have authoritarian governments, we have fascist governments, we have repressive governments, we have governments which are ultra liberal. We have all of that in the South. So what we have to find, in my mind, these networks that are south-south in compatible imaginations for that which we want to fight for, which is a society with justice for all without a patriarchal, without other forms of oppression and any other objectives, but not to romanticize the South is also very important because we in the South suffer a lot with our compañeras and compañeros, with the people who are governing in the South, who are killing in the South, who are oppressing in the South, which are uh, causing, which are committing crimes in the South and that are convinced and have all the power to cause damage, to cause harm in women and girls and children. So there's a whole complexity, and we want to listen, uh, learn together. I learned with collectives in Colombia, and I would like to hear of Yuvelis about the comadreo. I would like to the justaza. Uh, so thank you. Thank you to both. I don't know if Yuvelis, you want to talk about this, if you're there. So when you grow up in such violent contexts, so unnatural or un, so inhuman, the the kitchen, the mother is the love, those romantic things, like like those things really appeal to you. And I'm in a big family, and for me in particular, I like to think that feminisms were born in Comadreo. So this informal conversations in which women from the kitchen, from the stove, we create society because we're creating ourselves. So Comadreo includes the girls, and we begin to have conscience of why we are only making the food when there's a big strike happening. And the bad thing is when the men respond and they speak for us, like if we didn't have a voice, but above all, like if we if it weren't for us, we they wouldn't be able to continue with where they are or the strength that they have. And I don't know if you've thought of it, but the food, the struggles, the workers makes for kind of pushes us to create it. Society, a strike, a protest doesn't happen if people are hungry, and we take charge of making sure that people are fed. We make the food, we carry the water, we take the yuca, the plantains, we cook for hours to maintain ourselves there. Everybody gets there, everybody comes to eat, and we're all chit-chatting or comadreando there. We're all building what in that moment our own society, which is our society of comadreo, and it's born with women who agreed to conspire from that making food when you know that heat of cooking and that um and by the fire because from the kitchen from that place where we're relegated, that's where ideas are born. We all sit down with a bowl of soup with some rice with beans, and while we're eating we're also chit-chatting. We're having conversation. I think the comadreo is something that's taken more strength, in particular for Magdalena. We do this comadreo. All kinds of women would gather. We started to divide up work, and we started ourselves autonomous uh, mothers, children, girls, young women. And at the end of the day, we built what we think is a society of comadreo. And I also desire that you have co-conspirators, that you have somebody who build with, that you're able to talk with and develop it. And I wish you all comadreo and all this that we're talking about. That's something that we started many years ago, that we continue this so that our lives continue being free and our territories are free of extractivism. Thank you, Yuvelis. Come as you've seen, we went above time. If we can take 2 or 3 more minutes, I wanted to take on something that we shared in this webinar. It's not substituting fossil fuels with renewable energies which replicate the same violence, but instead of looking for a radical transformation, ecologist transformation that creates reciprocity, respect, co-responsibility, and as we've also said, from the principal values, at least two of them. One is the principle of common responsibility, but differentiated so that the global north assume their colonial responsibilities and those that contaminate, stop that. And from our part, we want to thank all the participants. We're going to share the uh, recording. We're going to share that by email. I want to thank Teresa, Ivonne, and Yuvelis for all their effort and participate. I want to remind you that the speakers not only talk about this, but they impact their lives, their communities in a daily basis. So thank you for everything. Very thankful and very thankful to have you here today. Thanks. Thank you, everyone.